Claydon, who'll be talking about recent work, and his recent exhibitions include a solo show at Hotel Gallery. He's also in the British Art Show, which is touring at the moment in Nottingham and will come to London in January. Stephen's also curated exhibitions, including one at Camden Art Centre with the abbreviated title of Strange Things, and his essay and thinking on that is downloadable from the Camden website. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. I'm unsure if anyone can hear me, actually. Can anyone hear that? Yeah? God.
It's all right. Ambient.
Yeah, okay. So I just need to escape that.
Yeah, sorry, let's just push it.
And this might take a while, so okay. That's
All the lights?
yeah, please. Is there a little light here as well, just out of interest? Is that a light? Get that on.
Yes, but I don't know how to do it. Julia? Julia, how do you turn this off?
Always just been on.
Yeah, sorry, it's usually on a standard, so we've never had to do that.
There it is. Okay. Hello? Hello? I'm going to start. Sorry, there was a bit of confusion there. You're going to be lucky enough to not hear me read from my garbled notes, but now we've got the light working, so you might have the unfortunate pleasure of listening to that. I was going to do a presentation that was based kind of chronologically from the kind of start of my practice as it kind of exists now. But I looked through it and I just thought, you know, I'd go on for ages and I don't think I'd ever really come to the crux of where I'm at now as an artist with my work. So I've decided to just talk about 2 shows this year, and especially since we just got an hour, including questions. One of the other things is, if you've got a really pressing question that you want to ask during the presentation, feel free to ask it. I don't know how it's going to work best, but usually it's quite interesting to hear you know, your impressions or questions halfway through so that I can say something interesting rather than just rabbit on about the work. But I'm going to start off with this, which is a show I was invited to be at in Munich at the Haus der Kunst early this year, under the umbrella title of Golden Times, which was a presentation by 3 artists, Maitu Pere, Django Hernandez, and myself. And for those of you who know the history of the Haus der Kunst, it was built by the Nazis in 1936, I think, in order to show, you know, their idea of what art should be. And it opened simultaneously with the Degenerate Art Show in Munich the day after or the day before. So obviously, like with a history like that, it's a very difficult space to entertain. Not to mention the fact that the building was based on an ocean liner, or at least the guy who designed the building also designed ocean liners. So it has these very long, thin rooms, and the room I had was 40 meters long. So I think to start off, there's a general kind of impression of the show, and I've started with these 2 images. I'm sorry about the size of the image. I thought we'd have a bigger screen, but these are objects that I call pixels, and I made a series of these. And these were in relation to a photograph I saw in the archives, which I had the luxury of being able to look through at the Haus der Kunst. And as you can imagine, the Nazi idea of art was based on a pretty kitsch version of neo-classicism, and arrayed in a kind of very symmetrical military fashion. And these two pieces were a kind of a nod towards the way that the history of the building and the way it was laid out, and in particular two sculptures, or a pair of sculptures by a Nazi artist, a very bad sculptor called Joseph Thorak. But to leave the history of the building aside, I just thought I'd start with these because I think they're emblematic in many ways of my work. They're models in cranked clay of a rolled steel joist or an I-beam. And for me, the idea of the brick or the I-beam or the pixel relates to my interest in sort of pre-Socratic philosophy in the start, when people tried to unpick the world around them and came up with the idea of the indivisible thing, the corpuscular thing that we know as an atom. And I suppose it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek reference to that I would make something like an I-beam, but it really goes deeper than that. And I think that to talk about utility in art and to perhaps misappropriate the idea of a thing or to force its context is something that's been with me since I was at art school, where I studied painting with Andrew. Not with Andrew, under Andrew. This is another image. And this is mainly sculpture, actually, or the little painting. But I vacillate between making film or sculpture, whatever seems to sort of fit the parallel research that I'm undertaking. And I seem to work like that. And more often than not, I will have a kind of concurrent theme of work that I'm involved with, but then there will always be sort of symptomatic or peripatetic, satellite, thematic kind of derivations or dead ends or little tracks that I'll follow, which spin off or are catalyzed by the main body of the work. And a lot of it is to do with something that I try and coin phrases for, but I don't think I'll ever really get anything that fits. But it's about a kind of idea of the passage of the material, and I suppose an idea about material fidelity or understanding a material from its substrate or from its atomic levels right through to the way it sits in the context of a cultural environment or spectacle like a museum, etc. And you know what happens to the importance of that stuff, the thingliness of that object. This piece was called Renaissance Malt, and it had a lengthy subtitle to try and explain it. But it's based on and I've got some images of it later, so maybe I'll wait then to talk about it at length. But just to give you an idea of the kind of environment that this was in. Okay, so we'll start with this piece. Now, I very cleverly forgot to bring the list of titles for any of this, and I'm really terrible with my memory to retrieve these things. But part of the title was about a prison. Now, this is like supposed to be some kind of oblique prison. So the prismatic nature of a thing, obviously, that has you shine white light through it. It has these. It splits it into its different constituent parts and becomes this sort of rainbow. But this was about an oblique prism because it's a retrospective prism, and I suppose amongst other things it's about art as language and technology, and in a flippant way there's a kind of with using the conceit of hindsight, I'm trying to understand the present through the origins of how we understand early man. And this is something that I've sort of dallied with over the last few years as well. This is a drawing I made of a Neanderthal and then had etched into a large brass plate. And this actually, you can't see it at all in the photograph, which I didn't take, is a polished piece of aluminium. And here we're talking about bricks and pixels earlier. These relate to these stuffs, these rudimentary things like clay and bricks, and nowadays pixels, which are our building blocks in constructing our object or a prop, or trying to make a vessel for the suspension of disbelief, which is, really the way I end up having to talk about work. I employ a lot of materials which I'm drawn to for a number of reasons. Primarily because I encounter them, and like this Bakram material or Hessian, which I encountered originally in a museum, and I think is a peculiar symptom of the way that museums show work. This material is Mylar, and this is a kind of technological material. I'll just go back to say that this is polished aluminium. The reason I use aluminium is I started a little while ago making portrait busts, or work in relation to monumental art and portraiture. And I was very clear that I didn't want to use bronze, which is the hierarchical language of sculpture, but I wanted to use a number of materials that either mimicked bronze, this kind of simulation of bronze, or other metals that had a kind of opposite material value. Now, I use aluminium because bauxite is the most common metal ore on the planet, and aluminium is its derivative metal. It's very difficult to extract, and I think you have to pass a huge electric current through it. So up until the last century, it was an extremely difficult and precious metal because of that, difficult metal to extract. But the reason I like it is because of its democracy. I think it has multiple applications, and it's the most ubiquitous, a very common and quite cheap metal. So in a way, kind of the opposite of bronze. I am aware of the inherent kind of problems with using aluminium. For instance, I think it was Napoleon III in the 1890s, or 1860s, when aluminium was still a very difficult metal to extract, had his dinner service made out of aluminium because it was such a precious metal. Everyone else had gold. And so it tells you the way that the history and the abundance of materials and status and the present canon can afford a certain material importance, where in another context or time it's considered to be a very common substance, like early plastics or what have you. It's very dry, isn't it? Sorry. And this is Mylar. This was developed by NASA to stop micrometeorites damaging satellite equipment, and now it's used for wrapping paper and wrapping people who just finished the London Marathon. So what I wanted to do was to have this kind of potted, oblique display, which references these kind of odd, I don't know if you've ever seen them on the continent. You get these circular, sometimes square towers, which used to have newspapers in them, and you could read what was going on at the time. They're these like information pylon things, and it was referencing them. The color code of this green was to do, which you can't see here. There was to do with authority, and actually I chose a green that the German police cars are painted. So and it's very nearby to where Archaeopteryx was found in this fossil beds. I have multiple themes in these things. That doesn't mean to say I want to load the thing until it becomes oblique, but I think that these things are in orbit around a kind of errant central theme. What Joseph Conrad referred to when he was talking about the yarns of seamen, or the stories of sailors, as the kernel around the nut. So you never got to see the nut, but it was described by this satellite or peripatetic orbit of the narrative. And so I have these ceramics here, which resemble some, which are actually studio ceramics from the 80s, which resemble something like dinosaur bones or early ceramics, or modernist sculpture. And then this image of what we imagine now with the patronizing conceit of hindsight for a Neanderthal to be. Now, in anthropology, up until very recently, the distinction made between earlier forms of human and Homo sapiens was that earlier forms of human didn't make art, and this was the only reason, they said, because this is the most sophisticated means of language they thought at the time, and of course since then it's been proved to be not a nonsense, but that there were approximations of manufacturing decorative materials and attempts to make rudimentary forms of art way before Homo sapiens. And of course they've realized very recently in Spain that they've discovered examples of Neanderthals making art as well. So it's about the folly of equivalence. It's about the folly of hindsight, and how we can come to conclusions and assemble a canon without a scientific method, or with prejudice. Was the point. I'm interested in the difference between utility in an object, or its what Heidegger calls it. It's what does he call it? I forgot what he calls it. Well, the utility in an object, and then its status outside of its material substrate, and its cultural significance. This is like a bulkhead light. Okay, so this piece again is about the passage of materials. I came across not a manufacturer, an importer of olives who was selling off his barrels, and the barrels were in this kind of terracotta colour. I don't know if it was an ironic idea that went back to the terracotta pots. The olives were brought to, travelled around the Mediterranean or across the globe in ancient times, but I really like that. And here it looks red, but unfortunately it's just the screen. But this refers, I suppose, to the way we understand an object in a museum as opposed to in its actual function. Now, I suppose a pixel or a RSJ or a brick are the lowest common denominators, and I think a barrel is the lowest common denominator in terms of a vessel, a plastic barrel for transporting goods. It purely is that, a vessel. It's probably one of the most illustrative or clearer pieces I've made it in a while, because I made a kind of juxtaposition or a binary where I've got this Roman olive oil vessel, which I bought from an antiquarian shop, which sits on top of the oil barrel. Now the top I cast in copper, and the reason for that was another nod to to trade, early trade in the West. At least we don't know much about what happened in the East at the same time, but the Phoenicians were trading copper and tin to make bronze, and at that time copper was very much in demand. And copper and tin don't usually occur together. they usually occur in different environments. So you'd have to travel, for instance, to Cyprus to get copper and to Cornwall to get tin. And I think that was a kind of, well, I know it was a kind of nod to an early form of global economy. One of the symptoms of the things that I make, and it's not the be-all and end-all, but I want something to have kind of political economy as well as a linguistic economy, as well as a kind of palette that references both those economies, like a heraldry, for instance, of utopianism, or a heraldry of antiquarianism, heraldry of modernism. This piece, I think it's called Burmese Revealed, and it relates to the museum and the idea of unveiling, the idea of Hessian being this peculiar symptom of displaying ancient artifacts. Why little boxes have to be covered in Hessian is still a mystery to me, to house a kind of Roman vase or something. But I was also making reference to the use of linen in the manufacture of a painting, for instance. So here the curtain and the plaque, which has no message, have been sort of rendered the same thing. This plaque is this kind of diseased kind of expanding foam, which has pyrite crystals, black beans, and glitter in it, and housed in a powder-coated steel frame. And again, it was about the kind of failure in time of a thing to be able to be vocal in its original state, in its either its utilitarian state or its position as a piece of functioning art in relation to the context that it was built. And I'm talking there about, I suppose, about the idea of the memorial plaque, or something more like a piece of public art, or a piece of architecture. And so that's, for me, that's kind of all three things are coming together here. In reality, it kind of looks a bit more like concrete with a kind of blistered, fleshy part than it does in this slide. And and the yellow just refers to a very common municipal yellow. There's a colour book called RAL, which all industry uses throughout the world, and this is their standard sort of signal yellow, which is either used as a warning yellow or just as yellow, but more commonly in industry as a standard warning yellow. So I wanted to bring industry, the hierarchy of and the status of the museum objects, etc. This piece is called Renaissance Malt. It's got a synthetic grass skirt, and my attempt to make what was known in medieval times as a bass racket. And in the early Renaissance, there was huge leaps forward in making musical instruments. And one of them was this precursor to the wind instrument, where you can get a deep note out of a small instrument. Up until then, a deep note had to be made from a very long instrument. And my reasons for being interested in musical instruments from history is, and there's very few surviving examples, and of course they're so precious that they have to be locked in vitrines in museums. And this was from a visit to the V&A, where I went to see the musical instruments, and not only were they locked in vitrines, but they also was shut, so I couldn't see them. So I had to kind of peer through, and I noticed these instruments called bass rackets. Now I ended up being able to find out about them, of course, by looking on the internet. And one of these kind of folky, real-aly people who'd made a bass racket had it photographed for scale next to a bottle of Anchor Steam, which I didn't use that. I used malt drink, because my studio's in Dalston, and I often use a lot of materials from the area. For instance, up until recently, now that my street has been gentrified, it had a covering of chicken bones, and so they reminded me of these knuckle bones from which was used as a game in antiquity and in ancient Greece, and is still used in parts of the Middle East. So this knuckle bone game, and I cast these things in bronze and used these bones, so thereby kind of taking away their mundane status, or using that transformation of status to draw light to the way we understand things in context. But these base rackets have been disassembled, and this is part of the mouthpiece, and this is just a reference to the way that we encase an object in an architectural environment, and this is a replica of a stand for a bassoon, an early that I saw in a museum. The base it's on, I suppose, is a piece of work separate or in itself. It's related to a dodecahedron, which to the Pythagoreans was a bit like having the blueprint to a nuclear bomb. It was a suppressed piece of information. They thought in the wrong hands it could be extremely dangerous. And contrary to our belief that science and mathematics are a very rationalized endeavor, they saw it very much in a more mystical way. And so this is really about Renaissance man or Western Renaissance ideas, and how a very privileged, newly emerged bourgeois set of individuals was shaping what was to become science and the collection and the museum and art by degrees through patronage. This relates to like the collections that were being made by these individuals and by alchemists of these odd objects. Like this is a copper chameleon skull fabricated. This piece is called Atop the Loam, and it makes reference to a piece of literature by Ernst Junger, who's a German novelist and diarist. And he wrote this kind of foreboding tale, which in many ways criticized modern life, but in particular criticized the Nazi regime. And the sculpture I made from several reference points. I cast it in foam again. And here there's this kind of a mythological idea of transformation that was in some ways to do with Slade, where the Zeus turns into a swan, but it also took kind of the Scott Walker haircut and a number of much more sort of popular reference points. There's kind of beans in here. You can just see these little black beans emerging from his chin. And the coat is a loading coat, which is worn by many, I suppose you'd call them aristocrats or aspiring aristocrats throughout the Western world. Certainly in Germany, it's a kind of badge of your rank as a upper middle or upper class individual. And so this guy has appointed himself more or less to this status, and is called Forester atop the loam. And in the Ernst Junger book, the Forester is this character who foments disobedience to his own ends. I've completely forgotten the title of this piece, which, seeing as it's such a kind of caricature of a thing, it is odd. There is a similar amount of parallel themes at work in this piece. Again, the London brick that I use, I suppose, is a semi-autobiographical thing. It's I don't often include anything to do with myself, but it's from London, and it for me it really is emblematic of this idea of how a brick can be the lowest common denominator, but also a cultural kind of object. It's a very significant thing. But here it's been cast in aluminium and polished. The Hippopotamus was a reference to an illustration made by a Norwegian illustrator who came to live in Munich called Olaf Gulbrandsen. And he worked for a Munich-based satirical magazine called Simplicissimus, which started off as a bit like Punch and an extremely sort of radical, well, not extremely radical, radical. And gradually, by the time it came to the 1940s, kind of got subsumed into a much more sort of middle of the road and culpable, and then it finally closed down in the mid-40s. But it was a cartoon that was depicting the sawing off of the teeth of imperial Europe, or imperial what do you call it? Aspiration within Europe. But I was thinking about it in relation not only to the drawing by Olaf Gulbrandsen, who lived in Munich, but also to finds that were made when the Hausdukans was being made, and it replaced a building like Crystal Palace called the Glass Palace, and I made a piece of work kind of in reference to that as well. But this piece was to do with the kind of fossil remains of elephants and hippopotami that were found on that site, in an environment we very rarely sort of associate with exotic animals, except for the zoo there. But this is fabricated in resin, and then it was painted with aluminium paint, and then in this kind of, I was going through this kind of very sort of performative, I suppose, not very cynical, and I wasn't really thinking about Joseph Beuys or actionism or anything, but it started to have that performative relationship between the sculpted object and myself, whereas I kept fucking it up, basically, and then I burnt it with a blowtorch, and then I filled it back up, and then I covered it in toothpaste, toothpaste because of its enormous enormous teeth, and then sunblock, because I found out that these things, hippopotamuses excrete a pink substance from their backs, which is a natural sunblock that they. And I was thinking of that as a kind of the screen, the idea of a screen with history and our relationship to it, and a kind of cover-up or something like that. But I can't go on about it all day. This is to do with the furniture of the museum. This is a kind of punitive device to start, rather than actually creating a barricade around the sculpture. I actually built it in, and the idea is that you would get a nasty bruise if you came too close to the object. I included, I haven't got any more images of it, unfortunately, because they didn't take any of the walls. I included a number of drawings by this artist, Olaf Gulbrandsen, which I got from the foundation there and from the Pinakothek in Munich. And I created these false walls to break up this very long space. This is a better view of the pixels. And I used a glaze by a German manufacturer called Botz, who make a glaze to make ceramics look like bronze. But it's also called crocodile, which references some of the animals that were found in the excavation of the area. This was to do with the Glass Palace, which was a large glass exhibition space, and I think maybe at some time I can't remember what you'd call it, but a place with botanical gardens, which was damaged by fire and replaced by the Hausdukans. But I think of them as drawings, but they're made out of these chromed axis points and these powder-coated uprights and horizontals and curves, etc. But this again was based on the uniform of the German police. I used that just as a kind of crass idea of just talking about authority within the cultural institution, and I just of course used the idea of the police as an ultimate level of authority, but in a kind of joking way. This piece is called Western Plan, and again I think it refers in many ways to those kind of collections that were made by individuals which gradually became collections that museums were based on, like the British Museum and John Soane's, etc. This is a giant frog in gold, but it's not real gold. It's made to look like gold. I love the idea that it's not real gold. If I could afford real gold, I wouldn't use real gold. I like the idea of this approximation of the tackiness of this object. These things aren't there to be seductive. They're there to employ the nature of seduction to shed light on the way that we understand the suspension of disbelief when we encounter a thing and we're told by a certain institution or cultural canon that this is important. Why is it important? Why is it any more important if it's made out of that substance? And why is it any more important if it has that provenance or history than anything else? This is part of a piano, a broken piano that I found that represents a synthesizer that I used to have. I used to be in a band, and so the yellow lacquered box was based partly on this synthesizer, and this was supposed to be the keyboard, which is again these rare outcroppings of sort of autobiography that come in. But really, when it comes to it, you accrue your influences in an individual way. So everything is autobiographical. And I'm gradually starting to come around to this idea with my work that you don't go against your better judgment. When I was at art school, it was very much about everything had to be this kind of very diffident, very difficult, crass understanding of this kind of, not anti-art, but an anti-aesthetic. And I'm trying now to employ aesthetic or aesthetics in the service of this other project I've got going on, which is to create these larger questions, these orbiting accretions of questions. This was one of the only paintings in this show. There was another one, but I haven't got an image of it. It had this frog taken from a Japanese, is it Hokusai? No, it's from a Japanese illustrator from the 19th century, and then I redid in the style of European storybook illustration art, like Arthur Rackham. So there's this kind of cross-fertilization of this difficult object that doesn't have any apparent rational provenance, but has a kind of, I suppose, a kind of importance through its apparent antiquity. And again housed with this butt crown. This is a bulkhead light that you find typically in institutions in the 70s, late modernist, sort of what I call swan song modernist institutions and galleries like the National Theatre or the Hayward, which I think are beautiful buildings. But there's a kind of reference to that there. And again, this green is unlike the other green that I was talking about. This is I see it as a very municipal green. It talks about the state, the kind of benevolent state, perhaps. Okay, so that's enough of that. This is the latest show, Trombone to the Bow Draps. Trombone to the Bow Draps was partly a reference to, I don't know why it's done it in grey and white. It's quite nice. So, partly in reference to a book that I was reading by Louis Ferdinand Céline, where called Guignol's Band, and he refers to his time, or a fictionalized time, that he spent in London in 1917. But the book starts in Orléans in 1940, where this bridge is being bombed, and there's the character Celine is trying to get some patients across the bridge in a hospital. What do you call them? Ambulance. But throughout the book, he starts with this boom, 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 in his very characteristic, very stylistic, very difficult to read style, which becomes quite addictive. He talks about this booming of the bombs, and then after the first chapter, completely changes, and we turn up in London in 1917, and he's taking a not necessarily nostalgic trip down memory lane, thinking about his time in London in 1917, when in actual fact he worked for the French consulate on Bedford Square, but in the book he pretends he was part of some big underworld scene, self-mythologizing to the end. Not only that, he fictionalizes as a kind of stylistic conceit anywhere that he's describing. His native Paris has a number of geographical mistakes, and he does the same thing in London. And at one point he talks about a place in East London called Trom, near Colonial Docks. Now, neither Trom nor Colonial Docks exist. And I was fascinated by that. And even though I knew they didn't exist, I was looking on old maps to see if there was a place called Trom, because he does refer to some interesting things that most people forget. One thing is that there was a Chinatown in Limehouse, and now it's moved, obviously, to Soho. But so there's all these kind of atavistic memories meld into fiction, one of which is this fictional conceit that there was this place called Trom. Now, I love the idea of Trom, and to carry on the idea of this circus of violence that he alludes to in the first chapter, he talks about the East End constantly booming with the sound of bells, and he talks about this descent into the underworld and his ultimate undoing, and the undoing of a number of his co-protagonists in the book. And so Trom Bell is this booming bell, a secularized bell, which talks about alarm and violence, and the way that destruction somehow has not necessarily a rejuvenating or creative element, but certainly through that maelstrom of destruction, shifting atoms and dust and rebuilding, cannibalistic environment, their change and creativity kind of can't be ignored. And so it's a really sort of double-edged, dodgy thing, and relates to the idea of material fidelity and our idea about truth, the old idea about truth to materials, which I prefer to call material fidelity, and how we could use infidelity to materials in the service of using an art object as a vessel for furthering another idea, in the same way that advertising, film, etc. does the same thing. This screen is called Die Lemuren, and makes a reference to lemurs, these forest creatures in Madagascar, which have been split off from and remained a kind of atavistic, not atavistic, an arcane species. They're called lemurs because the first biologists to come across them heard stories of them as these ghosts living in the woods. And lemur comes from a Greek or Roman notion of these malevolent forest spirits. And Ernst Junger used the idea of the lemur to represent a shady or evil character, perhaps somebody during his time in the secret police, or a mischievous, for me, like property developer or treacherous person, and how a love of a thing, like the love of a country, for instance, could lead you to become a traitor to that thing that you love. And I was interested in that in here. And then there was, I was related to this poem by John Donne as well, who talks about love in relation to treachery, and also Anaximander in the first fragment that we find in Western philosophy, where he talks about the idea that things are made of particles, and for particles to not become part of the swirling clouds of dust in the universe, and to become an object, is a kind of hubris. And so in order to become an object, it's only right that you should be destroyed back into dust for the hubris of taking on the image of a thing, or becoming a thing in general, not an image of a thing. So I'm interested in that. I'm on both sides. I'm an iconoclast, and I love the ornate nature of proliferation of stuff and things and information. I'm just going to go ahead. No, I won't actually. In a bit, we'll come to the other side of the screen. This is an image of the other side of the show. This is a kind of descendant of the piece I showed you with the bullfrog. This is another kind of reference to a synthesizer that I used to have with this kind of cheap USB roll-up piano that talks about how, I suppose this is a ubiquitous thing that might at some point become a museum object. Not my work, the piece on it. And again, I'm using aluminium. There's references here to Snoopy in his treacherous phase. So I'm thinking about, and this is you can't see it on the slide, unfortunately, but this is a kind of peculiar helmet that was referred to as a Snoopy helmet. It's a leather helmet. And I've also, so here it is, trombone to the bow traps. And again, I'm talking about the passage of materials, not just within the creative process or within geology, but in commerce. And likening perhaps the art object to something. There's a Heidegger essay where he tries to distinguish what an art object is, or distinguish it from a craft object or another object. And he says, what is an art object? Is it logs from the Black Forest? Is it any different to something in a knapsack, being transported in a knapsack? Is it, and this is why I'm interested in this notion of the barrel. I don't necessarily agree with Heidegger in that essay, but I think it's a fascinating essay where he talks about this constant sort of oscillation between concealment and revealing. And I think for me that's what art is about. The work in the work of art is that oscillating mechanical disobedience, perhaps, to become one thing or the other, and to create those kind of problems. This was Trombone. This is a glass fiber and lacquer bell, which was meant to be a receiver rather than an alarm. And it uses an analog feedback loop to create this kind of alarm, which sounds something like a bell and something like just an electronic drone. But the way that you saw this was through this aperture of bricks. Again, this related to that kind of reverie of destruction where bricks are flying through the air and come down and reconfigure themselves in this peculiar, precarious way. The work was never meant to be seen like this, but I thought I'd show you how the bell operates. And now the mic was close enough to the amp to create a feedback loop. And that's the slit in which you see it. I've been using these bulkhead lights quite a lot. This piece was called Castor Pollux, but then I just called it Untitled. But I'm a twin, so I thought I'd put two of them and call it Castor Pollux. But it really doesn't matter. It's this relationship to these codes and to the way an institution or a gallery or a shop or a domestic environment differ in importance in the way we confer status upon them. It's also very much about when you read pre-Socratic philosophy, and in particular if you read Epicureanism, where they talk really eloquently about describing what we now know as a photon. There must be photons, so they conject that there must be these particles of light. There can't not be. And at a time where there were people sort of performing all kinds of ridiculous superstitious ceremonies, it's amazing to know that for 1,000 years and more, there were these people in the pursuit of early science and irrational, and also turning it into some kind of mystic pursuit, a very ritualized environment in pursuit of the rational. So, a very strange role. So these reference that. And also, they reference an image that I saw in an elevator of a bell, alarm bell, and a stop bell on the London Overground. Again, that's a really blurred slide. I'm sorry, they really have come out awfully on this screen. It's probably better to see it like that. This is a reemployed archery target with a perspex front, a powder-coated cast tin can, and these spun wooden objects, much the same as you'd find like a wooden apple or something in a craft fair. And I think here, again, I'm stuck with this essay, The Origin of the Work of Art by Heidegger, but also taking it to a kind of slightly flippant 70s wine bar Beaujolais environment where you've got these kind of crafted objects defying their original context and piercing this sort of archery target or being emitted from it. And it's about that kind of regurgitation that we have to do when we consider an art object and the status of an object. The tin can is obviously the more important as a vessel for the thing that is inside it, and likewise the glass. But then again, the wine glass and the wine bottle have come to symbolize quite different things in their status. And I was quite intrigued by the idea of like the opposite of a good idea, the drunken idea, or like this Carlo Carra painting The Drunken Gentleman. And I think there might be some kind of reference to some metaphysical painting that I might have encountered at some stage. These are Yahoo. I don't know if you have Yahoo accounts, but as soon as you turn it on, at least on mine, you get this awfully kind of optimistic, grinning face telling you should read the email sent to you by your accountant, and so I thought about them in relation to theatre and the theatre of art production and that performative role, you know, between perhaps these binaries, the craft objects and the art objects, the cultural object versus the utilitarian object. And I've got this person called. And also, it was a reference to Grand Guignol, which is a kind of bawdy theatre that came about in Paris in the fin de siècle, so the 1900 or just before, where it was kind of stage kitsch and slight horror, and which is where Celine perhaps took his title, Guignol's Band. And it refers to this idea of Grand Guignol and perhaps the whole digital realm of the internet and Google as being part of that circus of media and kind of alarmist or tabloid spectacle. Now, in order to try to illustrate the way I work, I've come up with a number of sort of motifs. None of them particularly suit any particular aspects, but suit a general way of talking about the work. And one of them is Pigpen. I'm interested in Pigpen not because I'm a fan of Snoopy, although in this show I did make a few references to Peanuts. But Pigpen because of his climate. He's indistinguishable from any other character, or he is distinguishable from any other character because of his climate. He can't shake off this climate of stuff, and I see him as like the most real person in that cartoon. I really am drawn to the idea of a climate surrounding any object, no matter how benign or kind of base or unvocal or seemingly unvocal, because I think everything has this fugitive narrative or polyvocal nature. And so Pigpen, and that quote I gave you from Conrad about the yarns of seamen, very funny, is worked up in this. Now this is a digitally produced lens flare flash, which is then turned into a mediated back into a dot a screen dot and then printed onto this paper. And then in order to shuffle the molecules of the paper, I cook it. So I cook the paper so that it changes its molecular structure. Now, in so doing, it also kind of gives it a kind of vintage look, which is like quite cynical, but I think is quite appropriate for what happens to these things. I call them posters, and I've made, I suppose, about 40 or maybe about 40 of them. But they are prints, I suppose. I don't know. I prefer to think of them as posters because it has that more kind of democratic status. I sometimes think of them like album covers as well, but the molecular kind of dot on it is important to me. Again, it references pre-Socratic philosophy. This is a derivation or another version of that plaque that I showed you at the House der Kunst. Again, it's an architectural plaque which I cast and made in what appears to be concrete, but it's actually foam with a powder what do you call it? Aluminium section, which you can see a little better there, but unfortunately I don't have a detail of it. There was never one taken. And the keys reference an emblem that I'm kind of not necessarily reluctant to talk about, but it's an emblem that satisfied a need for an emblem, which relates to this kind of treachery. It might relate somehow to a kind of sinister motif, but it also might reference property development or what have you. But I'm not going to talk about the genesis of that or the birth of that, nascent birth of that, because it's not important. It's for me here. It's just a de facto kind of thing. This is a sculpture again in foam with black beans as an aggregate. I got black beans from a local shop, and it's for the local South American community. They have a special section in the shop. But it's supposed to reference aggregate, any kind of aggregate pebbles in concrete, in modernist architecture, injection molded. But actually, it references, I don't know, again, I'm reluctant to say what it references. Needless to say that okay, so it talks about that destructive process, like an iconoclastic process, but also as it talks about in some modernist sculpture. I was thinking of Lynn Chadwick sculptures where there's these very blank faces. But I'm reluctant to talk about iconoclasm. I'd rather talk about these things as fragments. I'm not necessarily interested in being iconoclastic. This is a replica of a jacket worn by called an ice bear, which was worn by bomber crews when London was bombed in the 1940s, and it was made by a manufacturer for me in Ulm in Germany, which was itself bombed by the British. And a lot of this is to do with the way that the East End has grown up out of this peculiar maelstrom of infamy or opportunism. These are the lemurs I was talking to you about earlier. This is an oil painting with airbrush on it. The keys are these sinister signals, and these are, and it has Pigpen's climate. It's a better image of it. And I mean, it's so dark. Okay, I'm gonna wind down in a second. I've already spoken about many of these. This is Woodstock out of Snoopy, and this is again about a static idea, the light bulb turned into the opaque dead sort of thing. And I thought I'd finish oh yeah, this is Snoopy in his treacherous phase as the Red Baron. And this is what I'd like to do right now. Have a drink. And that's the last slide. So, if we put the lights back on, how do I do the lights? If anyone wants to, actually... I'd just like to say that usually I'm more at home having some kind of discussion, because then that can kind of catalyse one of the many things that go throughout the work. And so what I was going to do was going to have questions and you know, as we were going through, but I realised the time wouldn't have allowed that. So if anyone's got any questions, I know I've gone over a little bit. I'd like to answer them.
I have two questions. One was, I was wondering how long it took you to make all the work you produced for the first show that you showed us. And
Yeah.
the second question was, you keep mentioning books and your interest in books from the Italy. I just wondered how important that was to you, where it kind of came from or when you realised.
Well, I think I was always trying to not make literary references, even though, you know, there's this parallel research that goes with each show and then mutates into the next show, and then there are things that I'm reading that don't even find their way into the work. I think I've decided to talk about it a bit more and make it a bit more explicit because I was puzzled at my own reasons for not doing that. There are periods where I'm too busy to read anyway, so I don't know, I just thought it was about time I sort of put my cards on the table in terms of that. And plus I'm much more interested now in that kind of, and I've always been interested in kind of cross-fertilization, but in letting in someone else's vision a bit into my work, especially if it rings with what I'm doing at the time. And I've been reading a lot of Celine, kind of exhaustively actually, and I've had enough now of it. But yes, it takes quite a long time to make this work. Certain things look like anything, like a painting, for instance, like that oil painting took quite some time. Certain things that seem like they're going to be a real doddle take forever, like casting these wine glasses. If you have a very thin thing next to a fat thing, it's very difficult to get out of them all. And so I went through months of trying to sort that out, and it's all become extremely costly. And so I put out a lot of money for this show. Luckily, I was given some money from an institution for the show at House de Christ. You know what? It's a difficult thing, but you know, when you look at anything, it's impossible to like even the most simplistic kind of abstract painting. You can't do that, and I've given up worrying about that. Not that I'm all that worried about it. I'm not necessarily worried about it. What's interesting for me about an artwork is when you encounter it, and if you can provide, because in these things they're complex things. Some of them are less complex, but it's going to catalyze a series of questions and trajectories within the viewer that ultimately come down to the same thing. What the fuck am I looking at? You know, what is this? Why should I be looking at this? Why am I not compelled to look at it? But why am I invited to do that? And essentially all I want to do is to instill in the viewer, well, why should I look at anything? What is it about seduction of an object, or being told that an object is an important heirloom culturally, and why would that be an interesting thing? And so for me, obviously my work, you know, I wouldn't, you know, I have to get to that stage. I can't just put any old piece of shit in it and say, well, this is art. I mean, I could do, but for me, I like to make it interesting for myself. I mean, I think a lot of it actually does come through. I think it's been really surprising how much people come back to me with a really clear reading of the work, despite its ostensibly sort of obtuse or obscure appearance. Right.
I just wanted to ask you about when the work's being conceived and made. Every object and material you use currently seem to be based on sort of systems or rules about how materials are sort of manufactured throughout history or being used. So I just wanted to ask about, is a work conceived totally or before it's put in production, or
Yes and no. I mean, some of the things do surprisingly appear or come out the same way, or not the same way. They appear, they have some comparison to the initial idea or the sketch that I made, or the series of things that I was interested in at the thing's conception. But often, I mean, it's not important to me that happens, and often the configuration might change. As long as there's a family of things that all correspond to the research or the palette of materials and that I'm working with, then they can be semi-interchangeable. What was there two questions there?
no?
I wanted to ask about the sort of, it's quite a specific question, it's something I was talking to someone about yesterday, but about this work in terms of a kind of colonialism, in a way, and what you thought about that, or if you did think about it, particularly with the work that was in Munich. I suppose thinking about the very specific types of knowledge, discourses and knowledges that you're kind of referencing, and I suppose that space, and I was thinking about when you were talking about Dalston and the kind of gentrification of the streets and the objects that appeared in that particular work, if that was something.
Yeah, it's certainly something I think about. The reference to the hippo was in relation to that, especially, as well as being something that was found in Munich as a fossil. But that piece refers to colonial aspiration. But I also, I mean, more importantly, think about that in terms of art and art canons, and certainly the way that institutions reference ethnographic or anthropological artifacts. And a lot of my work is related to that, but in a more general way. I mean, the thing is, one of the things that I can't be is an expert in any of these things. And so it's a real sort of, I suppose, a kind of an advanced Wikipedia kind of way of working. You know, these things are, one of the things I'm very interested in, is the folly of equivalence. There was a book that I used to be quite interested in. It was an early anthropological text called The Golden Bough. And in that text, the writer tries to make equivalence between something that happened in medieval Britain and something that happens now in Indonesia or something like that. Now, it was all very fascinating. He was trying to get to the crux of why it is that humans rely on magic or invent magic to make sense of their life, or superstition. But having said that, it was done by equivalence. There was no scientific comparison or study. So these things can't be scientifically proven. And within a very short period of time, the book was lambasted or lampooned even by the new science of anthropology as being useless, very interesting, but useless. And so I'm interested in, and we employ that every day. We make equivalences with absolutely everything we see, and we create narratives and families of things and taxonomies. As the taxonomies of display, the taxonomies of hierarchy that we employ in everyday life. And often I forget to say any of this until someone asks me a question, which is really at the crux of what I'm doing. You know, I'm just trying to highlight the ridiculous nature of that peculiar taxonomy, and often retrospective, self-serving taxonomies that exist within absolutely everything.
Steve, I'm really sorry, but I need to.
All right.
Can I say thank
Put
you
me
very
out of my
much?
misery.